Good evening. Welcome to the Miller Theater of Asia Society Hong Kong Center. And so delighted to see so many of you here with us this evening for this book talk. I'm sure if you haven't seen a copy of it, please grab a copy, and I'm sure Professor Mertha will be happy to sign it for you at the end of it. Bad Lieutenant, the Khmer Rouge, United Front, and Class Struggle, 1970 to 1997. And if you're a member, you have a discount as a Asia Society Hong Kong member. And when I was looking through the participants, I see a lot of you are not members. So please, let me plead, please become a member of Asia Society Hong Kong, because we need your support. Because during times like this, really interesting times. In fact, somebody quoted the other day, we're living in the best of time and the worst of time, from one of my favorite novelists. But there is, what's great about Asia Society Hong Kong is that we can bring you a program like this, from authors and leading academic in their field to come to Hong Kong. And so we can learn directly from them. And for a program like this, I really need to thank Professor Li Cheng. Thank you, Chen, for always collaborating with us. And I think those of you who know Professor Li Cheng is the founding director of the Center on Contemporary China and the World at Hong Kong U. And through our joint collaboration, and Professor Li Cheng is also our scholar in resident, that we can bring thoughtful academics, writers, artists, musicians. And you can see that we have a lot of great programs coming up this summer as well. And if you're a member, you are invited and coming at a member's price. So please support us. And I also want to thank Professor Andrew Mertha for being here, taking time from his busy schedule, and also thank the Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for helping to collaborate on tonight's program. I really don't have that much to add, except to, again, appeal for you to be part of Asia Society Hong Kong family. And also, again, there are exhibitions going on. The exhibition, the Homo Jin Show, is on until, we're probably going to extend it till August. And so please come and see the exhibition and take part in our programming. And I think with tonight's program, I think Professor Mertha is going to start with a short presentation on the book, and then we're delighted to have Professor Han Zhi to help moderate. Professor Han is the Associate Professor, Department of Politics and Public Administration at University of Hong Kong. And we had the pleasure of doing a book talk with you, I know, last August when your book came out. So please, and with that note, I want to welcome Professor Andrew Mertha to get the program started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Can people hear me? Great. So thank you all for coming. There are a number of people that I would like to thank before I get started, even though I have a fairly short time frame for the presentation. So I want to obviously thank Chang Li and Mali and Bendy and a whole bunch of growing number of staff at the Hong Kong University Center on Contemporary China and the World, who were instrumental in being able to coordinate everything. Absolutely, Alice and Holly and Jenny and Jamie and everybody at the Asia Society Hong Kong. And I want to just underscore that those of you who are not members really should be members, because I think they're doing. I'm not a religious person, but I think the Asia Society in Hong Kong is doing God's work. And then I'd like to thank my colleagues at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Khadija Hill, Anne Lemberger, Jaslyn Braswell, and a whole bunch of other people who I'm forgetting back at the mothership. So I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can so that we have time for Q&A and discussion, as well as Enza's remarks. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to stick with the script, because I'm going to be able to go through things more quickly that way. And then I can be more extemporaneous afterwards. So On April 15th, 1975, black-clad soldiers of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, or the CPK, hereafter referred to as the Khmer Rouge, entered Phnom Penh. And this was the liberation of Phnom Penh after 5 years of brutal civil war. Within a matter of hours, they emptied entire city blocks of their residents, forcing them into the countryside with little more than the clothes on their backs. This was done immediately to destroy any class distinctions, and it was punctuated by bursts of unimaginable violence and was sustained by a cruel cold-bloodedness. For this was a revolution that, as Cambodia's new leaders would boast, would far surpass all those that came before: the Russian, the Chinese, even the French. This new state, eventually known as Democratic Kampuchea, pitilessly eradicated all societal class distinctions, eliminated all private property, ended all means of capitalistic exchange, including money, and expunged all remaining enemies of the regime, both real and imagined. And all in the name of a hitherto unseen form of radical Marxism. This was, in their own words, year zero. In the 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days that the Khmer Rouge ruled the country, Cambodia's citizens were subject to mass executions, starvation, disease, and misrule, during which an estimated quarter of the population perished. And that's why what happened next is so baffling. Following one of the bloodiest political experiments in modern history, the Khmer Rouge rebounded after 1979 to rule over vast swaths of the Cambodian countryside for another 2 decades. More than 5 times as long as it had officially ruled Cambodia as Democratic Kampuchea. Throughout this time, it enjoyed a significant measure of public support against its adversaries in the countryside, pockets of which continue to the present day. As in the case of this hospital in the town of An Long Beng on the Thai-Cambodian border, built by perhaps the most personally ruthless of all the Khmer Rouge leaders, a guy named Ta Mok, who I'll come back to, among many other uncomfortable examples. And so this led to the question that really drove all of the research that went into this book, which is, what explains the durability of the Khmer Rouge movement, particularly after 1979, all the way up to its demise in 1997. And I've spoken to a number of people, and one of the reactions I get fairly frequently is, wait, they were around till 1997? And the answer is yes, they were. So what I want to do, for all the deeply analytical people in the audience, I want to just kind of get into what my approach was to try to get at this question. So, starting with this notion as a point of departure, the horseshoe theory, which I see a lot of the punditry in the United States talking about today in terms of pockets of support for the current administration in the U.S., this notion that the more radical extremes at opposite tips of the horseshoe might have more of an affinity with one another than with, say, moderate versions of their own tribe, if you will. So that's what kind of started getting me interested in this idea. And then my editor at Cornell University Press, the wonderful Jackie Teo, decided to put a Yeats quote at the beginning of, or a Yeats quote at the beginning of the book, to show people that I'm far more literate than I actually am. But as it turns out, this was turned out to be quite appropriate, because this idea of the center not holding is really, I think, a key to understanding my approach to explaining why the Khmer Rouge was so durable. So I kind of placed them into this framework where if we're looking at the top of the horseshoe, the light blue, as being kind of a natural political equilibrium, the Khmer Rouge occupied the two extremes on each side of the horseshoe. So on the one hand, United Front, and I'm just going to define how I use that term in the book, which is joint action between revolutionaries and non-revolutionaries with the goal of bringing the latter into the revolutionary camp or eventually eliminating them from positions of power if they refused. And then class struggle on the other, which is the notion that the capitalist system with its existing class structure is unfixable and thus can only be and must be destroyed. Now imagine that this natural political equilibrium, that is moderation, falls out of the equation. And we're left with this. This maps onto the guiding assumption in this book and this comes out of conversations that I had with David Chandler, who is the doyen of Cambodia studies. The notion that the Khmer Rouge were really able to do two things and only two things well. That is to say, they were able to undertake a bloody class struggle, as well as they were expert in manipulating United Front work that they engaged in. But because they were only capable of one or the other, when they reached the end point of one, there was really only one other place for them to go. So this kind of helps us explain the period that people mostly associate with the Khmer Rouge. That is to say, really when they first started to begin moving up into a position of prominence after the ouster of then the then ruler of Cambodia, Prince Sihanouk, in March of 1970, all the way up through 1979 when the Vietnamese came into Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge fell from power and escaped back into the jungles, the forests, and ultimately on the Thai-Cambodian border. But unlike other approaches, it also helps us to chronologically extend this framework into this. So we are able to then see a cyclical dynamic in the Khmer Rouge movement that in fact explains its contradictory nature as well as its longevity. With this approach, what I hoped was that we're able to trace the Khmer Rouge movement in a consistent fashion over time. And then ultimately, it fits in nicely to the overall trajectory of post-colonial, that is, post-1953 Cambodian politics. I can't really see in the back. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes. Excellent. Okay. So the approach that I took with this book was to not really look at the world doesn't need another biography of Pol Pot. And yet the scale of the Khmer Rouge movement is such that, apart from the massive amount of bloodshed that occurred on their watch, they're really not a particularly significant or substantial topic of study. And so one of the ways in which I was able to get past that significant challenge was to focus on the personalities of some of the people at the top of the movement. And again, not so much on Pol Pot and not so much on his second-in-command, Nuon Gia, but really looking at three of Pol Pot's top lieutenants, the people who are actually charged with implementing Khmer Rouge policy rather than formulating it. And in doing so, what this book really is it's kind of it's told through the political biographies of three of the top Khmer Rouge leaders, each of whom was quite different from one another, and try to imagine something like a DNA helix, whereas where these individuals' political biographies twisted and around with one another to explain the overall trajectory of the movement from the very beginning all the way to the very end. And so those three people are The first is Iang Sari, somebody who was more inclined to occupy the area closer to United Front. He was very much seen as the face of the movement, really from 1970 up until the late 80s into the early 1990s, as the kind of the outward face of the movement, whether it was occupying a seat at the UN or heading the foreign ministry during the Democratic Kampuchea period. He was somebody who was oftentimes seen as the number two person in the Cambodian, in the Khmer Rouge hierarchy. In fact, he was number 6, and he was, as I argue in the book, actually quite vulnerable in ways that the other leaders were not within the movement. So whereas I don't want to kind of take away any of the complicity that he had in what was going on during the Khmer Rouge kind of era writ large, he is somewhat of a kind of a softer version of the other two people in the book. And that, so this, the second lieutenant that I look at is a guy named Tam Mok. And he's probably the one that people know less of. And so if you'll indulge me, I just want to read a quick read from the book just to give you a sense of the prose and a description of this person. So like Yang Sari and Son Sen, the person who I'll talk about next, Mok possessed a brutal reputation. One off-cited nickname for him was the Butcher of Takiu. That, while certainly well-earned, belies the complex nature of his personality and approach to leadership and governance. Absurd rumors often swirled around him. For instance, he apparently hired bare-breasted ethnic minority female bodyguards and kept attack dogs as big as horses. His ruthlessness, not true by the way, his ruthlessness and temper were legendary, yet he was uniquely beloved by the people under his command. An interviewee described him as having bad words, but a good heart. Even his soldiers who defected in the 1990s said that they would return to fight for him if he ever called them back. He built numerous schools and hospitals in areas under his control, yet he is rumored to have had his troops put vanquished foes into ovens to roast them alive. He was the most secular of the Khmer Rouge elite, always more of a warlord than an ideologue, and took pride in never preparing before giving a speech. As he once declared, "I am not afraid of the leaders who have a lot of theories because they never practice them. I myself have no theory, I only know practice." But he was also a devout Buddhist in his later years, and his grave in An Long Veng is as much a religious shrine as it is a final resting place. He was Pol Pot's protector until he captured him and put him on trial. And finally, he was the most militarily adept among the Khmer Rouge leaders, but was the least value to the Thai and Cambodian authorities, brokering a final end to the insurgency. He was not folded into the Royal Cambodian Armed Forces upper ranks, unlike many of his subordinates who were given plum jobs, but instead waited to stand trial, dying in custody in 2006. So he is this person who's maybe the farthest away from Iang Sari on the kind of the spectrum between class struggle and United Front. Mok had very little patience for United Front. And then the person who, strangely enough, seems to have occupied the the area in between was a guy named Son Sen. Son Sen was the person who was, he was Minister of Defense during the Khmer Rouge era, and he was also the person ultimately responsible for the security apparatus, including, but by no means limited to, the notorious prison complex Tuol Sleng, also known as S21 in downtown Phnom Penh. He was somebody who, in the late 80s, early 90s, tried to bring the Khmer Rouge movement into the electoral politics of the early 1990s in Cambodia under the UN auspices of UNTAC, and he failed miserably. As a result, he became politically vulnerable within the movement, even as he moved towards a position tacked close to the shift away from United Front and into bloody class struggle that the movement undertook between 1994 and 1997. And eventually he was executed by Pol Pot along with 3 generations of his family, which led to a civil war among the very, very top leadership, with Tam Mok eventually arresting Pol Pot, where he stood trial in the summer of 1997, and then Pol Pot died the following year on April 15th, 1998. So what this does is it really kind of gives us a whole, maybe I'll leave this on here so I can refer back to it during the Q&A, but this gives a kind of a historical trajectory of what was going on kind of at the time. And ultimately, this raises a whole bunch of larger questions. One of the great things, one of the kind of most satisfying things about writing is that when other people read your work, if other people read your work, they come up with all sorts of insights that you never thought of. So there are a number of larger questions here, some of that I anticipated, some of which I have not, but I look forward to, after Enza's comments, I very much look forward to being able to kind of expand upon what I've been able to just introduce very briefly here, and welcome any comments, critiques, pushbacks, mitigations, and so on. But in the interests of brevity, let me stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everyone. My name is Enze Han. I'm going to be the moderator. So it's not necessarily me to comment, rather than it's having a conversation and for me to ask you for questions. One thing that was really interesting to me was you actually talked about as a puzzle, right? In a way that how come the Khmer Rouge was able to convince people for the second round of United Front, given that they show that true colors, during the time of genocide. So can you tell me more about this? How did the second round of the United Front come about, and how the people were convinced that was necessary to go on?
Yeah. So no, I mean that. Okay. Yeah, I mean that's really one of the central, that's really the kind of the central kind of nerve center of that puzzle. So one of the things about United Front strategy is that it can be really effective, but it can really only be used once. As you said, Enza, then the movement's true colors come out, and whoever is able to survive both literally or figuratively, they are, it's kind of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And yet the Khmer Rouge were able to do it, at least in this time frame, not only once, but twice. And not only twice, but with some of the same people, so survivors of earlier movements that were under no illusions of what the Khmer Rouge, what they were and what they represented. So there was some half-hearted talk amongst Khmer Rouge ranks of trying to kind of soften their position, but that really, I don't think that really convinced anybody. Certainly, not people. I think the people who were actually spouting that, were having a hard time convincing themselves, let alone other people. So I think one part of it was that there was a common enemy, and that was something that I think explains a good part of it, and that was Vietnam. So the first common enemy of the first United Front was the Khmer Republic, backed by the United States during the Cambodian Civil War of 1970 to 1975. The second United Front, it was the Vietnamese who had invaded, and one can make the argument that the Vietnamese represented much more of an existential threat to traditional Cambodian thinking than, say, the U.S. did during that earlier period. So that was one part of it. But another part of it was, had to do with and at the very beginning, the negotiation of calling it the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea took, a fair amount of time and a lot of convincing, because precisely for the concerns that you raised. In the book, I talk a lot about the fact that the Khmer Rouge were much better at organizing than the other coalition partners. And the other coalition partners, I think, were perfectly happy to let the Khmer Rouge bear the brunt of the fighting within Cambodia. As you had this this whole kind of range of refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border, each camp, so it went from like at the 1979, 1980, you had something like 24 or so camps, and by say 1991, you had maybe 6 or 7. You had a real convergence of these many camps into fewer. And each camp was run by one of the coalition partners. And one of the things that observers on the Thai-Cambodian border concluded was that the best run camps by far were those run by the Khmer Rouge. And part of that was military. Because the camps were a key resource for kind of logistics for the Khmer Rouge troops within Cambodia to fight the civil war. But another part of it was, Leninist regimes are, they're good at organizing. It's what they do. And so that was something that, while it did not really help the Khmer Rouge much during the elections, that plus being able to mobilize people against the Vietnamese within Cambodia in the rural areas, that was something that really carried the Khmer Rouge through the 1980s and made them, begrudgingly perhaps, but they were seen as the force within the coalition that could actually, that had the most likelihood of being able to eventually kind of push back against the Vietnamese.
So also in the in your one of the slides, you talked about in the end the cycle come back again in the late 1990s about another round of class struggle, which seems to me is very puzzling in a way that 60s makes sense because China were doing it, 80s still communist movements throughout mainland Southeast Asia, but 1990s, right? That's basically a very odd period of time. Given all the other communist movements have already died down, and then all the ones existing have already moved on from the previous round of Maoist class struggle type of tactics. So can you tell me a little bit more about why they decided to do another round of class struggle in the 1990s?
So some of the seeds of this were sown in there was a document that a defector from Tam Ok's troops brought with him in a document that was written in 1986, where it identified coalition partners as in quite literally an us and them type of relationship. The theys. We have to be on our guard against them, the people within this movement, which is very much along the the same kind of discursive kind of self-analysis that was very much the case in earlier periods. But I think it was really the Khmer Rouge's inability to and just utter failure in entering into the electoral process that kind of pushed them into extremes. There were certain people like certain moderating forces like Iang Sari who could have done more, but he was being pushed out of the movement by the late 80s into the 1990s and was the most high-profile leader to actually defect, and he did that in late 1996. But even for years before then, he was not there. So you had this movement towards kind of a more radical line that Tam Ok was very much kind of waiting for the pendulum to swing back in his direction, and people like Son Sen were opportunistically kind of following the political winds. There seems to be evidence that Pol Pot genuinely believed that the Khmer Rouge would do well in elections, which kind of underscores the delusions, at the very, very top of the system. And so with no place else to go, that was the program that they undertook, and it wasn't of the scale, obviously, of the Democratic Kampuchea period, but it was very similar to their rise to power from, say, 1973 to 1975. So for the 2 years before the Khmer Rouge came to power in the early to mid 70s, they consolidated the countryside in a way that aped other previous movements through collectivization and forced movements and doing away with class distinctions and money and things like that. And that was very much what was going on from 1994 to 1997. There were a couple different twists to that as well. There was, in 1994, there was a Khmer Rouge policy of kidnapping foreign, that is to say, Western backpackers in Cambodia, and there were something like 14 individuals in that year were taken hostage, and I think only one of them was released. And so there was this kind of reign of terror. Money was taken out of circulation within Khmer Rouge areas, and everything was not quite nationalized because it wasn't a national government, but it was there was no real kind of economic activity that was allowed outside of Khmer Rouge control. And then, of course, there were all sorts of purges and mass killings of ethnic Vietnamese, ethnic Lao, and people that were seen as associated with the victors of the 1993 elections.
So one thing about the series of Indo-Chinese wars, right? I mean, is how many international actors were involved in them, but also in the, let's say, the third Indo-Chinese war, and then you have the, let's say, relationship between Thai government and its support for the Khmer Rouge, and also, as I said, in a way that domestic sort of nationalistic resistance towards Vietnamese occupation. So I would like to bring this sort of into more of an international, broader kind of a perspective, in terms of how would this period of history tell us how we understand contemporary Cambodia's relation with Vietnam and with Thailand, given that, for example, in Hong San was the sections that came back from Vietnam, and then was the People's Republic of Kampuchea, right. And then you have the Royal Thai government who's supporting the Khmer Rouge, and then given currently Thailand and Cambodia has certain territorial disputes, etc. So how would you comment on this?
Especially right now in real time, yeah. So this was obviously part of a kind of a larger geopolitical context, which I don't go into as much because other people have covered it. People like Nyan Chanda, have done a better job than I think I ever could. But to answer this question, but also there was a part of the previous question that I forgot to mention, was the crucial role of Thailand in all of this, and not just Thailand, but Thailand vis-a-vis Chinese support. And one of the ways, and it was all kind of, by this point, by the 1980s, the Sino-Soviet split had pretty much, was a done deal. And Vietnam, being a client of the Soviet Union, China was, while the Chinese leadership was very upset with the Khmer Rouge's inability to maintain the country and unnecessarily provoke Vietnam, there was no question who they were going to support. The interesting thing there was whether the United States, with its warming relationship with China throughout that period, was also going to, what it was going to do in terms of supporting the Khmer Rouge. And there's this infamous comment by Brzezinski saying that, Pol Pot was an abomination. We could never support him, but China could. And so there's a whole list of unanswered questions. To what extent did the United States indirectly finance and support the Khmer Rouge during this period? We don't really know the answer, and there's a lot of speculation, but I think the conventional wisdom is moving towards there was something going on. We just don't know what the extent to which that was taking place. A key part of this also is that Thailand was brought on board. Essentially, China had made an agreement with the Thai government to stop supporting the Thai Communist Party, and so that was a way for Thailand and China to make up, as it were. And Thai support for the Khmer Rouge is absolutely critical, for all of this. Again, around 1994, with the elections having been won, you really do. That's when you see a lot of kind of money drying up from from foreign sources, and the Khmer Rouge were kind of dependent on their own money-making operations, which was in the timber trade as well as in the gemstone trade, which was brokered by Thai military and other middlemen, if you will. So it's not that they were out of money; they were still able to maintain rule and governance in those areas. But it was less of a the geopolitical the Khmer Rouge's geopolitical allies had pretty much, they saw that as a very useful opportunity for them to kind of wash their hands once and for all with the Khmer Rouge.
All right. I'm also interested to hear your journey, in terms of how someone who previously studied Chinese foreign policy, and then you wrote a book on China relations with Cambodia, with Khmer Rouge, which makes sense, right? In a way that international relations and the brothers in arms, and then into a much domestic politics of Cambodia. So how was this transition possible? And then also, can you comment? Can you tell us a little bit more about the methodological challenges and then also the change of approaches and understanding from the Chinese context to a Cambodian context?
So I was interested in Cambodia long before I was interested in China.
Oh, okay.
And so the question is how and why. What was and I think the place to really kind of pinpoint that was I started watching I was an only child, so kind of just did what my parents did, and they would watch the news. And so when I was around 8 or 9, I started watching the evening news, and the top story. By then the U.S. troops were largely out of Vietnam, so Vietnam was not it was the top story or the second top story, but Cambodia was tended to be the top story. And just those images were kind of seared on me in an early age, and it just, I obviously couldn't make heads or tails of what was going on, but it was, those images were quite powerful and stuck with me. And I wanted to study Cambodia, but when I was in college, there were just, there was Indochina fatigue. Cambodia was not the kind of the most significant, if you will, Southeast Asian countries, reflected in college curricula, et cetera, et cetera. And then I took a Chinese politics course and was hooked on China. So that was that. It wasn't until I went to teach at Cornell. I had a colleague, that some of you might know, a guy named Sid Taro, who's a big comparativist. And Sid came into my office and he said, one afternoon, and he said, you should become a real comparativist. Not just this China stuff, but compare China to something else. And at the time, I was thinking about a project on thought reform, and so Sid was like, "Well, why don't you look at fascist Italy?" Sid in an earlier iteration looked at Italian politics, and so I said, "Yeah, thanks, Sid. I'll put that under advisement." But this idea of trying to look at China comparatively was one that kind of stuck with me. And then I realized, well, I'm at Cornell. It has a world-class Southeast Asia program, and in fact, they teach Khmer language there. So I took 4 years of Khmer when I was there and became affiliated with the Southeast Asia program there. And so it became a very kind of nurturing environment for me to do that. I would never say that I have expertise in Cambodia. I mean, that is something that I leave to others. So I see it more as kind of doing pro bono work, with Chinese politics being my day job. But it's something that I was able to, one of the things, even with this book where China does not really figure terribly prominently, it really helped me think about Chinese politics in a different way that I think was very, very helpful to me and hopefully helpful to my students, and will help guide me in work down the road. As far as the methodological, this was about 10 years ago. Or 9 years ago, I was in Hong Kong, ready to give up on this project. I just started it, and it just did not seem to be going anywhere. And I got in touch with a Cambodia scholar, a guy named Steve Heder, who had this legendary private archive that people would speak about in kind of hushed tones, and everybody wanted to, be able to access it. And he basically told me that he'd just retired. He had, in his words, 3 or 4 more books left in him. So if I would write this one, then that would be one less book for him to write. But he said, if you're going to do it, you want to do it right. And so he allowed me access into his private archives, which were in a kind of storage area in Hackney, a neighborhood in London. And I just started scanning tens of thousands of pages, from the 1970s up through his work at UNTAC and beyond. So that was one key area of data. Another one was interviewing people in Cambodia, a lot of them being former Khmer Rouge, which I'd really done for the earlier book. By 2014, 2015, people who were quite open to talking to me before were no longer willing to do so. Kind of politics within Cambodia had become much more constricted, and people were a lot more afraid to talk to me. One of the people that I was able to speak to, one kind of celebrity interviewee, if you will, was Pol Pot's personal cook, who also became the party secretary of the Democratic Kampuchean Embassy in Beijing. And she was somebody who, she just died a couple years ago, but she was somebody who was quite open and was very helpful for me in my previous book. When I wanted to meet with her to follow up, she said that it wasn't convenient, and I'd tried for 1 or 2 years, and I finally decided to take no for an answer. Another source that was really, really helpful was the interviews undertaken for the War Crimes Tribunal, so the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. A lot of that stuff was on the Democratic Kampuchea period, but all these Khmer Rouge cadres that they were interviewing were people who had joined the movement earlier. And so, one of the questions they always ask, so when did you join the movement? What did you do? And all of that. So that was very helpful for me to look at the 1970s period. And then finally, I was, I visited all the sites, because I believe very strongly in being able to just kind of get a feel for the actual places that you're talking about. And then finally, I had some Confederates, if you will, research assistants, particularly during COVID, who were in Cambodia. Cambodia is not a place you wanted to go during COVID, because one of the things that they required was for you to demonstrate that you had $2,000 in cash on you, because if you died in Cambodia, that would pay for your cremation and burial. So that was just not something I was able to undertake. I was also vice dean at the time, so it was. But I had some really wonderful people who interviewed some witnesses on my behalf, and they did an extraordinary job. So it was really very much a group effort. But as social scientists would say, it was a mixed methods approach, but all the methods were very much qualitative in nature.
All right, so now it's Q&A time. So please, if you have questions, please identify yourself and yeah.
I'm Tohan Shi, a Singaporean freelance journalist living in Hong Kong. 2 questions. One question is, did the Khmer Rouge conduct massacre of various groups of people even after they were chased out of much of Cambodia in 1979? And my second question is, to what extent did the Singapore government really support the Khmer Rouge, whether directly or indirectly?
Thank you for those questions. So on the first question, yes, they did, but to a much less of a scale. So a lot of that was expended on the battlefield against the Vietnamese, but one of the key things they tried to do to win the hearts and minds of the people was that if, this is kind of standard guerrilla practice, if the harshest reprisals were reserved for Khmer Rouge cadres that abused the peasants, that they were trying to get to their side. But then after 1994, it really became kind of a tool that was used with a lot less precision and a lot more, it was much less of a scalpel and much more of a hammer to not only eliminate possible foes to the regime, threats to the regime, but also to create a credible degree of deterrence. On Singapore, I have less to say about this particular period, but one of the really interesting kind of what ifs was in my previous book. One of the things that Brothers in Arms, one of the things that I was looking at was the Khmer Rouge's desire to open channels of trade to various other countries. And one of the kind of initial successes in that endeavor, which was cut short by the purges at the very end of the regime, and then within weeks, the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, was a import-export company here in Hong Kong, in Central, where they were able to broker trade with countries like Japan, and Singapore, and trade was seemed to be so lucrative that there were plans to open a second import-export company, like the one in Hong Kong, in Singapore. So there was this kind of relationship there, which I think is understudied, and there's certainly a dissertation and at least a book there for people to look into. It's a part of people don't associate the Khmer Rouge regime or Democratic Kampuchea with trade, when in fact there was, beginning in 1976, it moved away from simply being a Chinese aid and trade with China, from rice from China, going to, or actually more kind of materiel moving from China to Cambodia, and kind of more kind of exotic types of foods and other commodities going to China from Cambodia. You really had an expansion into other countries within the region, and so it's kind of tantalizing, what might have been, not in terms of, that somehow makes the Khmer Rouge seem, better or less of what they were, but it complicates the picture in a way that I think is quite interesting.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back.
Hello, yes, my name is John Winsenberg, recently retired professor, mainly researching modern Chinese music in Shanghai in the interwar period, but I also did an undergraduate study on the Thai-Cambodian border in 1985. Had a chance to read your Brothers in Arms and also this book, and congratulations and thank you. My question, in the book you hadn't really raised the horseshoe theory. And I think the theoretical aspect is quite important, because there's still this burning question of exactly how and when and why, at what point did they really, the Khmer Rouge leadership, really lock into this kind of extreme detached brutality. And I'm a little surprised now to see your graphs with the horseshoe theory, where it seems to be an either or of United Front or class struggle, whereas I had kind of seen it as being, even back from the 1960s, class struggle as being some prominent element, and then the periods of United Front. And then what kind of was the, and so just want to see if you had considered, the overlapping possibilities, where they're both happening simultaneously. And then at what point do you really think they became the most extremely radicalized? Was it before 1970 or between 70 and 75, after 73, et cetera?
Thank you very much for the question. The horseshoe theory, it was something that came kind of ex post. It's one of those things, oh man, I wish I had, but my editor was really kind of pushing me away from really being too theoretical and thinking more in terms of, and that was just something that it kind of really came up ex post. But your question, part of your question that looks at, when did they become, radicalized? I think I do talk about that, and others have as well, that really the Khmer Rouge trajectory from its earliest years, so as a movement that kind of grew out of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party back in the 1950s, was one of disappointment. Disappointment after disappointment, whether it was the Bandung Conference or whether it was the fact that China was not supporting them, but it, in fact, was supporting Sihanouk, who was actually cracking down on the Khmer Rouge. I think there's an argument to be made that from the get-go, you had these disappointments that turned into this notion of not being able to trust anybody, and this idea of retribution that kind of took place simultaneously with this leftward shift of the movement. That Sihanouk was, occupied this unique position of being, a feudal monarch who also happened to be left-leaning, or at least one can interpret him as being left-leaning, which left the Khmer Rouge movement very little kind of space. Ideological space, as distinct from the free Khmer insurgency, the Issarak movement, which was very much kind of nationalist in tone. The Khmer Rouge were kind of trying to find kind of where they fit in, and the sweet spot really seemed to be in this notion of politics as retribution. Throughout the 1960s, they weren't really a viable movement to really do anything, and ultimately it was United Front that this idea of United Front that allowed them to then become a viable political force. I think in both iterations.
And so, with that in mind, then, do you think that it was the actual first time of having a concrete opportunity around 1970 that then really surged them forward, which also then surged them into this kind of extreme, detached brutality?
I mean, I think the brutality was there, but yes, it was the platform that allowed them to actually kind of realize, to achieve a critical mass of effectiveness as a political movement. But as I articulate in the book, we think about, class struggle really beginning in 1975 with the liberation of urban Cambodia and the kind of the exodus of city people into the countryside. But I argue that began in 1973. That it was at that point where the Khmer Rouge felt that they had enough power within the coalition that they could push the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese communists back into Vietnam. And they could start taking over. Kind of, at that point, they were laying quite low within the movement, really maintaining a very, very kind of modest profile. But starting in 1973, you had this essentially this organized and coordinated takeover of the movement, where there really wasn't any. You don't see a trajectory of kind of moderation towards radicalism. Whatever moderation was there was something that was much like after 1975, something that was maybe debated among some of the leaders, but was not ever really followed. And there's I write about this one vignette in the book where eventual Cambodian or American ambassador to Cambodia, Ken Quinn, who was a consular officer in the Can Tho consulate in Vietnam in 1973, climbed this mountain, Sam Mountain, on the Vietnamese-Cambodian border with his then fiancée to have a picnic, and they looked into Cambodia, and they could see, every village from, what the eye can see, essentially billowing black smoke. And that what he had seen, that Saturday afternoon in June of 1973, he couldn't make sense of it. But as he and his staff interviewed Vietnamese and Cambodians that were retreating from Cambodia back into Vietnam, that was the day when you had this coordinated shift where you moved all the peasants out of their villages that were burned, so there was no place for them to go back to, and then they were all put into collectives deeper within the deeper kind of behind Khmer Rouge lines, if you will. So that was, a kind of a striking, a dramatic example of this, very coordinated attempt at saying, well, we don't need to hide who we are anymore, rather than kind of being a shift in ideology, if you will. So that's how I would interpret that.
So you mentioned that a lot of people were surprised when you said the Khmer Rouge was still around until 1997. I certainly am surprised by that fact too. And then in your presentation, you mentioned the differences amongst the three lieutenants. So I'm curious as to say, in your research, have you found any common qualities or leadership qualities amongst these three lieutenants, sort of that contributed to the sustenance or the relevance of Khmer Rouge till 1997?
That's a great question. The thing that really was striking to me about this kind of level of analysis, this individual level of analysis, if you will, was just how different these people were. And, we think of we think of so Michael Vickery spoke about this idea called the standard total view, when people look at the Khmer Rouge, during the Democratic Kampuchea period, of everything was equally horrible everywhere all at once. And Vickery, I think, went a little bit kind of too far in in the direction that he was going in, but I think the basic argument that he was making was sound, which was actually you have quite a bit of variation. And it's important to understand that variation. Otherwise, this movement takes on this kind of cartoonish kind of aspect, if you will. And so it was really helpful for me to kind of delve into the personalities of these individuals to see how they governed and how they kind of undertook their responsibilities. And there's this one anecdote in the book where Steve Heder, the person who opened up his archives to me and who I dedicate the book to, was interviewing Iang Seri. And he had been waiting for a while for Seri to show up. They were supposed to have an interview at like 9 a.m., near the Thai-Cambodian border, and he didn't show up. It was 10:30, 11. Iang Seri finally shows up, and he apologizes for being late. He's like, "I'm sorry I'm late. I apologize for being late." And so they have the interview, and then they're off tape, and they're having lunch, and Heder asks, Seri, well, you have this policy now that if there were instances of kind of overreach, of violence, that you would that you would acknowledge that and apologize for that, and so what do you say about that? And Seti said, well, we didn't mean for that to happen. So, why should I apologize? And Steve says, yeah, but you didn't mean to be late, but you apologized for being late. So, and, the thing there was that Seti started laughing because he was like, oh, you got me, whoops, and, that's a personality type that you could not, the other two lieutenants would not, certainly Son Sen, that's just not how anybody could imagine him ever being. And, whereas Mok was, very much in the, if you'd kind of taken he was a freedom fighter before joining the Khmer Rouge, so he was in East Iraq in the 1950s. He was somebody who you could just see as a warlord, kind of straight no chaser. He didn't necessarily need, democratic Kampuchea, as the garb to wear. I mean, he was somebody who was very comfortable in the battlefield and for whom politics was simply power. So you really, but he was somebody who had a sense of humor, who could, he was very, just a very scary individual. But I would talk to people who served with him. And, I would take my students during an intercession course in January to Cambodia, and sometimes we'd bump into some people who had kind of served as soldiers under Tamok, and talk about some of those, some of their experiences. They loved the guy. They still love the guy up in An Bang, which is very much a kind of a Khmer Rouge stronghold, and there's still a lot of Khmer Rouge living there. So whereas I don't think anybody really shed a tear for Son Sen. And with Sari, just kind of bringing it back full circle, I think lots of people saw him as just kind of a slippery, if Tamok was a warlord and Son Sen was kind of looked at security with mathematical precision, I think people saw Iang Sari as kind of like a wily, oily politician. And one of his nicknames in university was Crooked Teapot, which implies things not being him not being quite straight, in terms of how he dealt with people. So very, very, very different people, which I thought was worth kind of bringing out, not to mitigate, not to but rather underscore the complexities within a movement that we wouldn't necessarily expect to be there.
Other questions? Yes.
Thanks, Professor Mertha, for the talk. My name is Dan Tam. I'm a journalist as well. My question is, given the role that Vietnam played in defeating the Khmer Rouge in '79, how do you explain the persistent anti-Vietnamese sentiment that obviously made the Khmer Rouge so relevant for all those years?
Yeah, that's something that that is not a product of Khmer Rouge rhetoric or ideology. Rather, the latter was a reflection of kind of this more traditional kind of existential hatred for Vietnam on the one hand and Thailand on the other. As a Hungarian American, Hungary was a country that was once great. And now is not. And so, you have a lot of kind of, when you speak to Hungarians about, say, parts of what is now, Slovakia or Romania, it's you have the same kind of disdain for, they took our territory, like, what people in Cambodia speak about, say, Vietnam or Thailand. So Cambodia was once, pretty much was the kind of the main power on on mainland Southeast Asia, and little by little, much like Hungary, just kept on losing every battle until it became kind of a very kind of, one would say, insignificant kind of part of of what the empire had been 1,000 years ago, or 1,200 years ago during its heyday. In fact, the temples at Angkor were just given back to Cambodia after the Second World War. So this was, at that point there was really very little which the Cambodians can kind of speak to within the kind of the territory of Cambodia to to point to national pride. It all had been absconded and taken away. So I think there's very much that so there's that part of it. I'm not a scholar of that of that region, but I think, just from an observation, I was talking with some people earlier, before the talk, as somebody who had studied China and lived in China, lived in China for 7 years, I I got a feel for the place, which I thought would help me kind of navigate things, in Cambodia fairly well when I first started going over there. And in fact, things were so incredibly different. Then I think there really is a kind of a cultural line, whereas I think it's a cliche, but I think there's more than a little truth in it, that when you're talking about Vietnam, as kind of a product of East Asian culture, whereas Cambodia is, and Thailand is and Myanmar is a product of South Asian culture. I think there's really a there. And so it may explain why. I think relations had been a little bit tougher more recently between Cambodia and Thailand because of the temple at Prevahia and their shared border there. But I think kind of the anti-foreign bias within Cambodia, I think, is much stronger towards Vietnam than it is towards Thailand for among other reasons, for that reason as well. So I think the Khmer Rouge really just, were a reflection of something. That was something that they could easily harness. And it's also something that they happen to believe in as well. So it was, it was not a tough sell either for them internally or for the people that they were trying to mobilize.
But also during French colonial rule, right, it was Vietnamese actually ruled over Cambodia rather than, as an intermediary. So.
Right. I mean, there's this image of, of the, the Vietnamese putting having a
Civil servants.
I'm sorry?
Like civil servants.
Yeah. I mean, originally the Cambodians were going to be the civil servants, in the French idea, and it kind of went the other way. And there's this, this horrible French quote, that the Vietnamese grow the rice, the Cambodians watch the rice grow, and the Laotians listen to the rice grow. Which kind of gives you kind of the way in which they saw, those various peoples within that area, and it some of it kind of was a reflection of earlier strands, but it also, I think, locked in some of the kind of the differences and the otherings that are very much kind of part of, drive your question.
One last question. Okay, well, if no more questions, and then let's give a round of applause to Professor Mertha.